Shalom and welcome to Nail or Glide Jewish Ministries, where we teach the Bible from a Jewish historical, cultural, and linguistic perspective. We're continuing in our series in the book of Genesis, and this is teaching number 17. This will be the final teaching in part 1 of this series in the book of Genesis. Now, we'll be focusing on Genesis chapter 11, verses 10 to 32, and I've titled this teaching, The Blessing of the Name. The majority of the text in Genesis chapter 11, verses 10 to 32, is a genealogical list of names of the descendants of Shem, which also includes the ages of the fathers when each son was born to them. Let's just begin with a few questions to be thinking about as we go through this teaching. Number one, since there is already a genealogy of Noach's 3 sons in Genesis 10, including his son Shem, why does the Bible record a second genealogy of Shem in Genesis chapter 11? Number two, what is the purpose of the genealogy of Shem? Number three, how do we see the blessing of Shem fulfilled in his descendants? And number four, how can the genealogy of Shem help us with dating the flood and the Tower of Babel? So hopefully we will find clear answers to these questions as we go through this teaching. Now, we're going to begin with the full text, or I should say the majority of the text in Genesis 10, Genesis 11, verses 10 to 26, right? There's still another 6 verses, but we're going to do the majority of the text right here at the beginning. It's a lot of names and ages that are given for the birth of each son, but we're going to see how the details are important as we go through this genealogy. So let's begin with verses 10 to 26. These are the generations of Shem. Shem was 100 years old when he begot Arpachshad, 2 years after the flood. And after begetting Arpachshad, Shem lived 500 years, and he begot sons and daughters. And Arpachshad lived 35 years, and he begot Shelach. And after begetting Shelach, Arpachshad lived 403 years, and he begot sons and daughters. And Shelach lived 30 years, and he begot Ever. And after begetting Ever, Shelach lived 403 years, and he begot sons and daughters. And Ever lived 34 years, and he begot Peleg. And after begetting Peleg, Ever lived 430 years, and he begot sons and daughters. And Peleg lived 30 years, and he begot Reu. And after begetting Reu, Peleg lived 209 years, and he begot sons and daughters. And Reu lived 32 years, and he begot Serug. And after begetting Serug, Reu lived 207 years, and he begot sons and daughters. And Serug lived for 30 years, and he begot Nahor. And after begetting Nahor, Serug lived 200 years, and he begot sons and daughters. And Nahor lived 29 years, and he begot Terach. And after begetting Terach, Nahor lived 119 years, and he begot sons and daughters. And Terach lived 70 years, and he begot Avram, Nahor, and Haran. Lots of names, lots of years, right? But we're going to see how these details help us to understand the scriptures and with some important dates along the way. Now, in contrast to the horizontal genealogy found in Genesis chapter 10 of Noach's 3 sons, the genealogy of Shem in Genesis 11 is a vertical genealogy. And I talked about this when we went through Genesis chapter 10. And just to illustrate that on the screen, we have the genealogy of Shem, right, which gives all the names of his sons, and then certain sons, and then all the names of various descendants, right? Only going a few generations. So it's not a descending so much genealogy, right? It's more looking at it widespread horizontally. Now, Genesis 11 is a vertical genealogy. And as we see on the screen, this is going back to Genesis 5, right? But it's one descendant after another, and not counting all of the sons, right? Now, the generations of Shem are a continuation of the lineage from Adam through Seth to Noach, right? As we see on the screen from Genesis chapter 5. And now in Genesis 11, we have from Noach through his son Shem to Terach, right? And on the screen, we have the descendants going from Noach, his son Shem, right? And then going all the way down, following the blue arrow to Terach, right? And then there's descendants after him, but these are the main ones we're focusing on right now. Now, we know that there was a blessing in the generations of Shem. Noach blessed Shem after the flood and after the incident with Ham and Canaan, as we read in Genesis 9:26, when Noach was speaking and he said, "Blessed be the Lord, the God of Shem. Canaan will be a servant to them." So of the three sons of Noach, only Shem was blessed. Now, I want to point out that the English name Shem comes directly from the Hebrew word Shem and simply means name. So it's a very generic name or word, right? So literally, it is the word for name, and it's also here used as a name, right? The name Shem. And we're going to see the significance of that as we go through this teaching. So remember that the name Shem means name. Now, what is the purpose of the genealogy of Shem? Shem's genealogy provides several practical purposes. We're going to kind of go through some of the main ones that I have seen as significant. The generations of Shem help us understand how the lifespan of man was eventually reduced to 120 years. Before the flood, God declared that man's lifespan would be reduced, as we read in Genesis 6:3, and the Lord said, "My spirit will not contend with man forever, because he is also flesh. Therefore his days will be 120 years." Now, we know by means of the generations from Adam to Noach, as we have them listed in Genesis 5, that the average lifespan was 912 years, excluding Hanok, right, or Enoch, because he did not die, he was taken. And so we went through this in Genesis 5, and you can check out the numbers for yourself, but the average lifespan from Adam to Noach was 912 years. Now, a couple of questions to be thinking about. Number one, how did God reduce the lifespan of man from the average of 912 years to 120 years after the flood? And number two, when did this change in lifespan occur? Now, God does not tell us exactly what he changed in humanity, in the human body, to reduce the years of life. However, we see clear evidence of a reduction in the lifespan from the age of Noach, who lived to be 950 years, to the decreasing years of life in the descendants of Noach through Shem. Noach lived to be 950 years. That was kind of above average for before his day, right? He lived a good long life. But then we see the descending ages of Shem going all the way down to Terach, right? And so they're listed on your screen. Shem lived to be 600 years, Arpachshad 438 years. As you go down, you have Nahor, who only lived 148 years, and then Terach, his son, who lived 205 years. Now, it's interesting to see how God implemented a reduction in the lifespan of man. It was not an immediate reduction. However, it did occur relatively quickly, considering man's years on earth were reduced by about 85% from 912 years to 120 years. It's a huge reduction, right? Almost 10% of what people lived before the flood. In just 2 generations, from Noach to Arpachshad, man's lifespan was cut by more than half, from 950 years to 438 years. In just 3 generations, from Arpachshad to Peleg, man's lifespan was nearly cut in half again, from 438 years to 239 years. Now, although Terach lived to be 205 years old, his father, Nahor, only lived to be 148 years old. Now, I just want to make a note that the name Nahor is both the name of Terach's father and the name of Terach's son, right? So don't get confused by that, but we see the name twice, and it's kind of, you have Terach in the middle. His father was named Nahor, and his son was named Nahor. Now, there is no one age of a human life. However, God reduced the average human lifespan after the flood from 912 years to an average of 120 years. And we know that Moses died at 120 years as is recorded for us in Deuteronomy chapter 34. Now, do we know when the flood event occurred, as well as the incident of the scattering of mankind upon the earth as a result of the Tower of Babel, right? So 2 different incidents in time, but how can we understand the timing of these events as we understand the genealogy of Shem? Now, since we are given the age of Shem in connection to the flood, we can calculate the approximate year of when these things happened. We read in the first two verses of this section in Genesis 11, verses 10 to 11, quote, "These are the generations of Shem. Shem was 100 years old when he begot Arpachshad, 2 years after the flood. And after begetting Arpachshad, Shem lived 500 years and he begot sons and daughters." Now, Shem's son, Arpachshad, was born 2 years after the flood. From the birth of Arpachshad to the birth of Avram, right, who's later called Abraham, there are 290 years. We then add 2 years from the flood for the birth of Arpachshad, and we get 292 years. Now, according to a chart on the chronology of the patriarchs in the Bible Knowledge Commentary, Abraham, or Avram, right, was born in the year 2166 BC. By adding 292 years to 2166 BC, we arrive at the year 2458 BC for the flood. Now, this is an approximate year because we're calculating backwards in history, and it's difficult to be precise, but it's a pretty good, I think, guess or calculation as we have it in history and using what we read in the Bible. So the year 2458 BC, about 4,500 years ago, was when the flood occurred. Now, Shem lived to be 600 years old. Since Shem lived for 500 years after the flood, and it was only 292 years from the flood to the birth of Abraham, or Avram, therefore Shem lived to see Abraham's day. We do not know if they actually met each other, but Shem was alive when Abraham lived and when Isaac and Jacob came into the world, right? So again, we don't know if Shem actually knew Abraham and if he actually saw Isaac and Jacob as well, but according to what we read, Shem was still alive when all three were on this earth, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Abraham lived to be 175 years old, as we read in Genesis chapter 25. Now, Shem outlived Abraham by 33 years. Noach blessed his son Shem, and Shem's life was truly blessed, right? He got to see Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, or he was on earth at least, when they were on earth at the same time. Now, another question about the Tower of Babel. When were the people scattered and their languages confused at the Tower of Babel incident according to the genealogy of Shem? By following the genealogy of Shem, we can calculate that Peleg was born 101 years after the flood. Now, we know that Peleg was born in the days when the earth was divided, as we read in Genesis 10:25. And that seems to be a hint of when the Tower of Babel incident was stopped, when the Lord interjected, right? Therefore, if we date the confusing of the languages and the scattering of the peoples by the year Peleg was born, the act of the Lord against the people building the Tower of Babel was in the approximate year 2357 BC, right? So again, the Tower of Babel stopped being built in the year 2357 BC. We don't know exactly when they started building it, but sometime within about that 100-year period between the flood and when God stopped it. And again, we see how quickly man goes to his own ways just 100 years after the total destruction of the world. Sin spreads very rampantly. Now, as we come to the end of the generations of Shem, as recorded in Genesis 11, we see a familiar pattern in the scriptures. In the same way that the generations of Adam conclude with Noach and his 3 sons in Genesis 5:32. The generations of Shem conclude with Terach and his 3 sons, as we read in Genesis 11:26. And Terach lived 70 years, and he begot Avram, Nahor, and Haran. The final few verses of Genesis 11 then continue the lineage of Shem through Terach by telling the story of the quote-unquote generations of Terach. So I want to read the last 6 verses in Genesis 11, verses 27 to 32. And we read, "And these are the generations of Terach. Terach begot Avram, Nahor, and Haran. And Haran begot Lot. And Haran died in the presence of Terach his father, in the land of his birth, in Ur of the Chaldeans. And Avram and Nahor took to themselves wives. The name of Avram's wife was Sarai, and the name of Nahor's wife was Milcah, the daughter of Haran, and the father of Milcah and the father of Iscah. And Sarai was barren, and she had no child. And Terach took Avram his son, and Lot the son of Haran, the son of his son, and Sarai his daughter-in-law, the wife of Avram his son. And he brought them out of Ur of the Chaldeans to go to the land of Canaan, but they came until Haran and settled there. And the days of Terach were 205 years, and Terach died in Haran. This brings us to the end of Genesis chapter 11. Now, it's interesting to see the repetition of relationship status in the generations of Terach, right? Read about the son of so-and-so, the daughter of so-and-so, the wife of so-and-so. And it's just interesting how much it is emphasized and repeated over and over again in these 6 verses. The generations of Terach started just like the generations of Shem as far as the wording in the beginning of the verse. Now, despite verse 27 beginning with the identical Hebrew wording as in Genesis 11:10 for the generations of Shem, and it says phrase ele todot or ve ele todot, right? And these are the generations. Verse 10 introduces a genealogy, whereas verse 27 introduces us to the story of Terach's family. And I mention this because we see this oftentimes in the Bible. So again, this phrase ele todot, or even just the phrase toldot, it's generally the generations of someone, right? And it can give us a genealogy. However, it can also be the history of or the story of. We actually already saw this back in Genesis 2 when it was, I think it was the toldot Hashemayim va'aretz, right? The generations of heaven and earth, which tells the story in a different perspective from Genesis 1. So anyway, it's just interesting to see how the Bible uses this phrase. And we read here about the story of Terach's family, Ele Todot Terach, right? So the details in the generations of Terach are included in the scriptures for a reason. Terach was the father of Avram. Avram's name is later changed to Abraham, who is the central biblical figure leading up to the Messiah. So these 6 verses regarding the generations of Terach provide background and context for the family life that Abraham, right, Avram, experienced throughout his formative years, right? We read about the birth up until actually about the age of 75 as we go into Genesis chapter 12. Now, as the generations of Terach unfold in these few verses, read about several life events, some good and some not so good. So I just want to review some of these main life experiences we read about. Number 1, Terach had 3 sons, Avram, Nahor, and Haran. Number 2, Haran had a son and he named him Lot. Number 3, Haran died in the presence of his father. Number 4, Nahor married Milcah, Haran's daughter. Number 5, Avram married Sarai. And number 6, Sarai was barren. She had no child. Now, in the irony of the name Avram, which in Hebrew is the same, Avram, right? And it means exalted father. Now, it's beautiful the way the scriptures are so prophetic and providential, right? Now, whether Terach understood at all what he was doing by naming his son Avram, right, exalted father, and then Sarai was barren and had no children, which left Avram, the exalted father, fatherless, right? And we know the story of Abraham and Sarah, Avram and Sarah, right? And how God would use that situation to bring forth the child of promise. But it's beautiful just to see the meanings of the names and how God brings about his plan. In just 4 verses, we read about the birth of 4 sons, the death of 1 son who was also a father, the marriage of 2 sons, and the barrenness of Sarai, the wife of Avram. Right? So just in Genesis 11:27 to 30, we read about all these different life experiences. And this is what Abraham went through as part of his formative years. Now, despite the family hardships, we know that God was providentially working to bring about his plan for Avram and Sarai. We then read of another major life event for the generations of Terach. Verse 31, and Terach took Avram his son, and Lot the son of Haran, the son of his son, and Sarai his daughter-in-law, the wife of Avram his son, and he brought them out of Ur of the Chaldeans to go to the land of Canaan, but they came until Haran and settled there. Now Terach was living in Ur of the Chaldeans with his 3 sons and their wives, and so we see it there on the map in southern Mesopotamia, Ur of the Chaldeans, and he went up north, right, to Haran. Now after Haran died, Terach took his son Avram together with his wife Sarah and his grandson Lot on a journey to the land of Canaan. They never made it to Canaan, but settled in Haran, not to be confused with the name of Terach's son, which is Haran. And hopefully you can see the difference there. It's just that first letter. The name of the place, the city, is Haran with a chet, right, with a hard H. And the name of Terach's son is Haran with the hey, with the soft H sound. And I asked the question, are these two connected? Now, listen, for years I read my English Bible, and it just says Haran for both. It doesn't distinguish between the name and the place, but the Hebrew clearly does. And I just want to maybe understand why they're so similar. Are Haran, the name of the son, and Haran, the name of the place, the same name? Now, just to explain this a little bit more, the name of Terach's son, Haran, appears to come from the Hebrew word har, meaning mountain. It's very straightforward. And so the name Haran could be mountainous or mountain man. The city name Haran with the het is not as obvious or clear. It could be from the root harar, meaning parched or dry, or there's another meaning of harar, meaning free. And I want to explain that a little bit more. And it's possible that there was a play on words and they were connected, and there was a little bit of a change in the name to apply a meaning. And I'll explain that again in a minute. So another question is, or 2 questions: why did Terach decide to take his family on a journey to the land of Canaan? And number 2, why did Terach not take his other son Nahor and his wife Milcah, right? Or they're not listed as joining them on this journey. Now the text does not directly answer these questions. It appears from the context that Terach wanted to escape the shame of his family tragedies and start a new life with them. And that could be the change of the word Haran to Haran, with the meaning of Harar as free or freedom, right? So to start a new life. Then we have another situation where Lot was orphaned as his father died, right? So as the grandson of Terach, while Avram and Sarah had no children. And so from that perspective, you kind of have this harar, meaning of parched or dry, right? Kind of like the fruitless or the pain of the land in a sense. So in that way, you could have that meaning of Haran with the chet. So anyway, that's the 2 possible understandings of maybe how they're connected with naming the place after the son of Terach, Haran, but also changing it to explain their kind of purpose in life, or what they were experiencing in life. Now the text does not mention what happened to Nahor and Milcah at that time. Maybe they went with them at that time, maybe they didn't. However, we know at some point that Nahor and Milcah also moved to the area of Haran, to the city that bears Nahor's name, Nahor in Aram Naharaim, right? We read this in Genesis 24, Genesis 27, and Genesis 28. And they may have been right next to each other, Nahor and Haran, or they may be the same city or area, right? But either way, we know that the descendants of Nahor and Milcah lived in that area. Now, did God speak to Terach to go to the land of Canaan, or did Terach just want to escape the family shame of the death of a son and the barrenness of a daughter-in-law? It's impossible to know exactly why Terach made this decision, but we do know that God was in the details of preparing Avram, Terach's son, for the plans that God had for him, right, in the land of Canaan. We also know that Terach was involved in idolatry, as we read in the book of Joshua. As we read this, Joshua said to all the people, "This is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says. From ancient times your fathers lived beyond the Euphrates River, namely Terach, the father of Abraham and the father of Nahor, and they served other gods. Then I took your father Abraham from beyond the Euphrates River and led him through all the land of Canaan and multiplied his descendants and gave him Isaac. That's Joshua 24, 2-3. Now, it's possible that Terach was fleeing the idolatry in Ur of the Chaldeans. However, the text never addresses this specifically, and whether Terach continued to worship idols in Haran, it's possible as well, because that's still beyond the Euphrates. Now, we don't read any more details about the life of Terach, except that he died in Haran, which we read in the last verse. And the days of Terach were 205 years, and Terach died in Haran. That brings us to the end of Genesis 11. Now, in another contrast of the generations listed in Genesis chapters 5 and Genesis chapter 11, in Genesis 5, we read about the death of each descendant of Adam, including Adam, except for Hanok, right, Enoch, who did not die, and Noach, whom God used to bring about a great salvation during the flood. And we know Noach died later, as recorded at the end of Genesis 9. But Genesis 5 focuses on the death. And that shouldn't surprise us, because we actually know that Genesis 5 basically gives the generations up to the judgment of the flood, which happened in the days of Noach and his sons, right? And the name of one of the descendants of Adam is Methuselah, right? Or in Hebrew, it's Metushelach, which is they were sent to their death. And we know that he died in that year of the flood as well. So it was very prophetic. And so it's interesting how Genesis 5, in a sense, mentions the death of each one, and then eventually the judgment when all were killed. In Genesis 11, we read about the life of each descendant of Shem. It continues, it says, this one lived for this amount of years. Now, in Genesis 11, the verb to die is only used twice. The verb to die is lamut, right? And we only read about Haran's untimely death and Terach's death at the end of Genesis 11. So the generations of Terach are ultimately the story of Avram, which begins when God called Avram, as recorded in Genesis 12, and continues for the next 14 chapters in the book of Genesis, right? Genesis 12 through 25 all include and really focus on the life of Avram, or Abraham. And we'll get into that more as we continue in the next teaching. Now, at the beginning of this teaching, I asked two questions about Shem. Number one, what is the purpose of the genealogy of Shem? And number two, how do we see the blessing of Shem fulfilled in his descendants? As we have reviewed in this teaching, there are many practical reasons for recording the generations of Shem, including the ages of each successive generation, which provide us with dates for major world events, for example, the flood, as well as the Tower of Babel. The birth and life of Avram, or Abraham, is the defining purpose for the lineage of Shem, right? That's the ultimate purpose, or the defining purpose, to see this descendant who would go on and continue to have an effect in this world even till today. Now, it's interesting to note that just as there are 10 generations from Adam to Noach, as recorded in Genesis chapter 5, there are also 10 generations from Shem to Avram, or Abraham, in Genesis chapter 11. Now, God used the righteous life of Noach to bring about a great salvation in his generation, and God would use the righteous life of Avram to bring forth a great salvation for all of the world through the Messiah, right? The ultimate promise that came through the lineage of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Now, I just want to end this teaching with some concluding thoughts. The life of Avram is a major part of the fulfillment of the blessing of Shem. Now, just as a reminder, the Hebrew name Shem means name, right? It's a very simple word that also is used as a name, right? The name Shem is used as a name of Noach's son, and it was through that son, Shem, that the blessing continues. Now, Nimrod, together with the people who were with him, built the city and Tower of Babel in order to make a name, Shem, for themselves. As we read in Genesis 11:4, and they said, "Come, let us build for ourselves a city and a tower with its top in the heavens, and we will make a name, a Shem, right, for ourselves." The descendants of Ham, through his grandson Nimrod attempted to make a name, a Shem, for themselves through their human plans, which God ended by scattering them upon the face of the earth and confusing their language. In Genesis 11:10-32, we read of the descendants of Shem, which culminates in the three sons of Terach. Out of Terach's three sons, only one would receive the blessing from Almighty God, and that son was Avram, whom God blessed, as we read in the beginning of the next chapter. And I don't want to get too much into Genesis chapter 12, that's the next teaching, but I just want to read Genesis 12:2, where the Lord said to Avram, quote, "And I will make you a great nation, and I will bless you, and I will make your name great, and it will be a blessing." In the middle of this blessing, God said to Avram, "Va agadla shemecha, and I will make your name great." God promised to make the Shem, the name of Avram, great. God blessed Noach and his sons after the flood, as we read in Genesis 9:1. Noach blessed Shem after the incident with Ham and Canaan, as we read in Genesis 9:26. In Genesis 12:2, we see the verb barak, to bless, for the seventh time in the Hebrew Scriptures. The Lord blessed Avram and promised to make his name great. The details in Genesis 11 reveal to us a contrast in the plans of man versus the plans of God. As we read in Proverbs 19, verse 21, many plans are in a man's heart, but the counsel of the Lord will stand. It's only God's plans that ultimately will be fulfilled in the end. The people who followed Nimrod wanted to make a name for themselves, but God scattered them over the face of the earth, confused their language, and put an end to their plan. God then called one man by name, Avram. God blessed Avram and made his name great, so that all the people of the earth would be blessed. This is the conclusion to this teaching on Genesis chapter 11, verses 10-32, the blessing of the name. It's beautiful to see how this genealogy of Shem, right, the name, ends with Avram, whose name is blessed, right? And God would make him a blessing for all of the earth. So hopefully we answered all of our questions and see the beauty, the majesty of God's word and how it all fits together. Here are some of the resources I used in my preparation for this teaching. As always, feel free to share this teaching with others. I also want to invite you to partner with us. Neiler Aglai is a nonprofit organization, and we're totally dependent on donations from viewers like yourself. So please consider giving a donation of any amount to Neiler Aglai. You could do so on our website, neilerglai.com. I also want to invite you to subscribe to our weekly emails to keep up with our teachings if you're not already receiving them. Again, you can do so on our website, neilerglai.com. It's also Psalm119.105.org. They're the same website. It will bring you to the same place. Or you can simply scan the QR code on your screen. It will take you to neilerglai.com, and then you can click the Give or Subscribe tabs as needed. Thank you so much. God bless you, and see you again next time.